In March of 2003, Tony Blair appeared before the UK Parliament to press the case for invading Iraq. 84 of his own Labour MPs opposed the invasion, but Blair was clear. Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and needed to be stopped. 2 years later, Saddam was under house arrest and no WMDs were found. Blair had been misled by Bush. Except he hadn't really. Right on the eve of the 2005 election, the Downing Street memo was leaked, and that document showed that after meeting with the CIA director, the MI6 director informed Blair that Bush was set on the invasion and the facts were being fixed around the policy. After that 2005 election, Blair resigned, Labour fell into ruin, and they've never since won an election. But across the pond, there was some hope. In the same year that Blair resigned, the leader of Australian Labour, Kevin Rudd, had ousted the 11-year-old Conservative government. But despite the OECD ranking his government as having the best response to the GFC, he was knifed after not even 3 years. The global Labour movement ignored this as a sign.
Our mission, New Britain, New Labour, New Britain.
Blair life!
I know that Labour hearts are heavy across the nation tonight.
To Australians who supported Labor, I know that you're all hurting.
This is obviously a very disappointing night for the Labour Party.
So if you have a look at when UK Labour and Aussie Labour are in at the same time, it's nearly non-existent. In fact, the only real main window was right after the war. For different reasons, both countries started with new prime ministers. For Churchill, he was voted out, and for Curtin, well, he died. Now, the thing that characterised both of these post-war governments was nationalisation. For Churchill's successor, Clement Attlee, it was really big. By 1951, about 20% of the UK economy had been taken into public ownership, and this saw things like the Bank of England, airlines, coal mining, railways, electricity, and gas.
The great social security scheme has been applied to all.
Attlee also put the shackles on the economy by keeping food rations to try and reduce foreign consumption.
So Clement Attlee is a total communist man. The only alternative is capitalism and the free market.
Well, that was exactly Churchill's angle going into the 1951 election.
The enfeebling tendencies and fallacies of socialism and free ourselves from socialist rule.
The message worked a treat, and Labour's 6-year stint was over. Now, in Australia, almost the exact same thing happened. So our other wartime leader, Robert Menzies, was in opposition rallying against the Labour Prime Minister Ben Chifley. Like Attlee, Chifley put shackles on the economy so that we didn't see a repeat of the unsustainable growth of the 20s that resulted in a depression. He also went on a nationalisation drive, except he tried to nationalise the entire banking sector. Obviously, they didn't like that, and they flocked to support Menzies. Menzies outspent Labour 10-1, and in 1949 returned to government. Now, the 50s, and for Australia the 60s too, was a conservative whitewash. It was prime Cold War paranoia, and Menzies and Churchill were effective Cold Warriors. Churchill had World War II in his resume, and Menzies literally tried to outlaw the Communist Party in Australia. Now, though effective in the 50s, by the 60s, that sort of messaging was losing its potency. The Labour Party's insistence on slow economic growth, coupled with nationalisation, was over.
These are not what this party is about.
And so began an era that we'll call sexy Labour. Rather than having dull conversations about the means of production, both Labour parties were to be led by charismatic candidates from prestigious universities, and were both leaders that American intelligence were very sceptical of. We'll start with Harold Wilson. So he'd actually served as Attlee's Secretary of Overseas Trade, and while serving in that role, made a number of overseas visits to Russia, earning the praise of Stalin. Now, back in 1963, the leader of Labour, Hugh Gaitskell, died from a lupus flare-up.
Hugh Gaitskell, tragically early, has been taken from us in the prime of life. Millions who mourn his passing share in some measure the sorrow of his wife and 2 daughters.
So Gaitskell had unsuccessfully tried to revoke something called Clause 4 of the Labour Party rulebook, which committed Labour to nationalising all industries. Remember Clause 4, it's crucial. Now, when the Oxford-educated Wilson took over the leadership right before the 1964 election, he knew better than to play with the clause. He instead ran on a pro-working class message saying that the exploitation of workers would hold the nation back from technological revolution.
But that revolution cannot become a reality unless we are prepared to make far-reaching changes in economic and social attitudes which permeate our whole system of society.
Not only that, but US intelligence was paranoid that Wilson was a Soviet agent. The CIA's chief of counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton, actually kept pushing the narrative to MI5, so much so that they even had Downing Street bugged. Wilson always remained incredibly paranoid about that Soviet allegation. Now, Wilson's regime wasn't remotely radical. Perhaps his most radical move was to not send any soldiers to Vietnam. This obviously annoyed Johnson, but Wilson also provided financial aid, which annoyed his own party. The only real thing that Wilson nationalised was the steel industry, and again, he knew to stay clear of Clause 4. That being said, Wilson built so much public housing that by 1970, nearly half of Britain's houses were publicly owned. But down here, our era of sexy labour was very brief, but far more radical.
Oh, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
The Gough Whitlam story is wild. I have 3 videos on it and I'm going to make a documentary. Basically, our Conservative government was in from 1949 to 1972, and it was Whitlam who finally took them down, and let's just say he was keen to make up for lost time.
Dude, that Gough Whitlam guy was insane.
Not only that, but free healthcare, free university, legal aid. He saw a 33% wage increase.
But that was because of inflation.
Actually, no. Inflation was at 17%, so he still smashed it. It was the era in which Australian workers had the highest share of the nation's wealth.
Damn.
He also tried to nationalise the mines and told the US that they might lose their lease for the Pine Gap security base in the middle of the outback. Accordingly, the US made a guy called the coup master, Marshall Green, as the ambassador to Australia, and ex-CIA worker Christopher Boyce accused the CIA of calling our Governor-General John Kerr, our man Kerr. For non-Aussies, the Governor-General is a ceremonial role with one power: sack the government if it becomes non-functional, and it had never been used before. When Whitlam's supply bill failed to get through the Senate, Kerr sacked Whitlam and installed the opposition leader Malcolm Fraser as the caretaker Prime Minister. The CIA then laundered $24 million into Fraser's Liberal Party through Nugan Bank for the 1975 election. Whitlam lost, and Labor were cast back into opposition. Back over in the UK, Wilson resigned in 1976, and Labor lost the next election to Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Sexy Labor was over.
They all agree that the unions have too much power. Under those circumstances, that is an occasion when Parliament can act.
Now, in the 1980s, Australia went full opposite land. So Britain had gone conservative, America had gone really conservative, heck, even communist China had gone conservative. Remember, this was perhaps the most iconic quote from the decade.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
But in Australia, we had the Labor Party in power. But in order for them to stay in power, they needed to change the nature of the party so drastically that many today would hold them as traitors of the party. Now, our 80s Labor Party had 2 faces to it. One was Bob Hawke, who was the Prime Minister, and the other was Paul Keating, who was his Treasurer and later took over from Hawke. Together, they nerfed the union movement in 1983 when they struck a deal with the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Ironically, the council that Hawke used to be the president of. The crucial thing about this deal was that Hawke got the unions to settle for a wage freeze. Remember, wages are the primary thing that unions advocate for. Basically, he did this by instead offering benefits to the pension, a WHS commission, and tax cuts. On top of this, Keating liberalised the economy. He floated the Aussie dollar, basically letting the market rather than the Federal Reserve decide the exchange rate. On top of this, he allowed foreign banks into Australia, removed tariffs, and when he became the Prime Minister, privatised our government-owned bank, the Commonwealth Bank. So in Australia, not only were Labor now not nationalising industries, they were also privatising existing public assets. Keating's still alive today, and this is what he said.
Politically, in the Labor Party, I fought the left most of my life, always mostly on behalf of the United States.
So the Hawke-Keating government was an incredibly successful one, and across the pond, UK Labor were taking notes. Not only had Thatcher dominated the scene during the 1980s, but in 1992, John Major led the Tories to yet another victory. This brought John Smith to the leadership of the party, but in 1994, he died of a heart attack.
And it was those ordinary rank-and-file Labour workers and supporters who came forward with their floral tributes all day today, to the man they'd expected to be the next Prime Minister.
There were a couple of names thrown around for who'd replace Smith, but the two real contenders were Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. They'd previously been close allies, and so agreeing not to split over the issue, they agreed to run on a joint ticket with Blair as the leader and Brown as his powerful deputy. Blair then easily won leadership of the party. Now, earlier, during Labour's years in the wilderness, Blair had said this about the direction of the party.
The image of the Labour Party's got to be an image that's more dynamic, more modern, more suited to the 1980s. I don't actually think it's nearly so much a matter of right and left as people make it out. What I do think is that it's a matter of style.
Now, when Blair was a fresh MP, Labour ditched the red flag because it reminded people of the Soviet Union and replaced it with a rose. Now, remember Clause 4 that I mentioned before? Well, Blair was the one who finally abolished it, declaring that it was going to be a new Labour and a new Britain. In 1997, Blair smashed Major in a landslide victory, and on day one, kicked off New Labour by handing over control of interest rates to the Bank of England. 2 weeks later, Blair went to Northern Ireland to try and resolve the 3-decade-long conflict between the Unionists and the IRA. Apart from wanting peace, Blair was keen to show that New Britain was going to be a global player again, and not just a dwindling power. The result was a resounding success for Blair, who a year later helped facilitate the Good Friday Agreements. Essentially, Irish paramilitaries would disband in return for the UK reducing their forces in Northern Ireland and allowing people to have Irish or British citizenship. Blair's Chancellor of the Exchequer, what we'd call Treasurer, Gordon Brown, had the tough job of delivering the budget. Now, for New Labour, they promised to spend no more than the Tories were without raising common taxes. So how exactly do you do that? Well, this was his idea.
I say it is right that we employ the unfair profits of the privatised utility to pay for a fair deal for the unemployed.
Essentially, privatised utility companies would be taxed for their unused profits, what we call a windfall tax. Blair argued that this was making up for the fact that the Conservatives sold off utilities at massively undervalue and then retired to fat jobs on these boards, as these companies then massively overcharged common people for power. It was a one-off tax that gave the government about £5 billion, which it then invested in getting 2 million people into a job by providing training, subsidising employment, and providing voluntary work to the unemployed. It was a huge success for Labour and was much more imaginative than just hiking corporate or income tax. On top of that, Blair pumped a whole lot more money into the NHS.
A predecessor of mine famously said she wanted to be able to go into the hospital of her choice on the day I want, at the time I want, with the doctor I want. Remember that? Margaret Thatcher's argument for going private. I want to go to the hospital of my choice on the day I want, at the time I want, but I want it on the National Health Service.
So by the year 2000, Labour had the budget in a healthy surplus, and so put $2 billion extra into the NHS and $1 billion extra into education. By the end of Labour's stint in office, the amount spent on both education and health would be doubled. Brown and Blair then moved to introduce the national minimum wage and offered tax credits to parents to reduce child poverty. Pardon the pun, but it was all red rosy for Blair at the turn of the millennium. On top of this, he'd had some giant foreign policy successes as he persuaded Clinton to intervene to help the Kosovo Liberation Army negotiate a settlement with Yugoslavia, and his intervention in Sierra Leone stopped the endless cycle of military coups against the civilian government. In 2001, Blair managed to keep the massive majority of 1997, and despite this incident with his deputy John Prescott,
immediately swung round and landed a punch straight on his jaw. The man then wrestled the Deputy Prime Minister onto his back and held him down over a small wall as police and Labour Party officials tried to release him.
He managed to put the Tories to the sword. Of course, 2001 was crucial for something else that just so happens to result in YouTubers being demonetised. Blair supported Bush in his invasion of Afghanistan, and the world didn't bat an eye. But as it became apparent that Bush also wanted to invade Iraq, 2002 would see Blair come under heavy criticism for the first real time in the history of New Labour. Unlike Harold Wilson with Vietnam, Blair was viewed as rolling over to the Americans, especially considering that other EU nations like France and Germany explicitly rejected the idea of an invasion. Rather than take invasion off the table, Blair's angle was to push Bush to go through the UN, something that Vice President Dick Cheney viewed as unnecessary. Blair got Bush to push the UN for something called Resolution 1441, essentially an ultimatum to Saddam to disarm his weapons of mass destruction or face serious consequences. An intentionally vague threat. Well before the invasion, protests erupted in London. In March, Bush issued Saddam an ultimatum: leave Iraq in 48 hours or be invaded. The next day, Blair pressed the House of Commons for approval, offering his resignation should the vote fail. The vote did indeed get through, but not without damage to Blair. 149 MPs opposed it, most of which were Labour and not Conservative. Of course, no WMDs were found after the invasion. So the image of New Labour went from being centrist reformers to now being warmongers. This perception wasn't at all helped when right before the 2005 election, the Downing Street memo was leaked. It showed that back in 2002, the MI6 director had briefed Blair on how American intelligence would quote-unquote fit the policy of an invasion of Iraq, and that they'd use terrorism and WMDs to promote public support for it. On top of that, Blair had privatised British Rail, and so going into the 2005 election, a YouGov poll showed that most British voters viewed Blair, and indeed New Labour, as being on the right of the political spectrum. The saving grace for Blair was that the Conservatives supported the Iraq invasion and couldn't capitalise on Blair's dwindling popularity. So Labour held on, but lost a big chunk of its majority, while the Liberal Democrats picked up the biggest third-party vote since 1923. Ultimately, under pressure from within, Blair resigned in 2007, right before the GFC. Let me know in the comments below. Blair's New Labour, yes or no? When Brown took over, he made the call to bail out Northern Rock Bank and begin austerity measures. The new Tory leader, David Cameron, capitalised and won the 2010 election with a minority government.
Our country has a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority, and we have some deep and pressing problems: a huge deficit, deep social problems, and a political system in need of reform. For those reasons, I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats.
Now, Gordon Brown had just about the exact same lifespan as Australia's Labor Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. Unlike Brown, Rudd's response to the GFC was broadly popular, and in the March 2009 quarter, for the first time ever, Australia's growth rate topped the developed world. This was courtesy of 2 sets of stimulus packages, plus China remaining strong throughout the crisis. At the end of 2009, Rudd tried another landmark policy, the emissions trading scheme. Like Blair, Rudd was insistent on having private businesses willingly cooperate in programs and not needlessly making an enemy out of them. So instead of going for a tax on carbon output, he opted for the carrot instead. An emissions trading scheme would see businesses allocated a number of carbon permits. If they went over those permits, they then had to purchase permits off of another company that had them in surplus. Theoretically, businesses could really profit from reducing their CO2 emissions, except for those dependent on fossil fuels like the mining industry, who were huge donors of the opposition. And this policy showed the first main issue that Labor parties faced in the post-New Labour era: minority parties. The unpopularity of Iraq gave the Liberal Democrats a huge boost in 2005, and throughout the 2000s, the Greens were growing in popularity in Australia. Now, Greens voters would argue that they're not actually a threat to Labor in Australia because of preferential voting. So if the Greens candidate is unsuccessful in a seat, those votes would then presumably go to Labor. But the upper house is a little different. Each state gets a certain number of senators, and the most popular parties get a proportion of the Senate seats. So for instance, in 2007, the Greens received 9% of Senate votes and so held 5 out of 76 Senate seats. Given that Labor held 32 Senate seats and the opposition held 37, Labor relied on the Greens to get any policy through. And this situation isn't unique. The crossbench in the Senate typically holds a lot of power. And so the Greens much preferred a carbon tax to Rudd's emissions trading scheme, and so actually teamed up with the opposition for totally different reasons to vote it down.
Global warming is hurting us all. The government's global warming scheme is not the cure. The Rudd government's emissions trading proposal will hand polluters $7.4 billion in free permits in the first 2 years and prevents serious greenhouse gas reductions.
Like the video if you would have passed it. Embarrassingly, Rudd agreed to shelve the emissions trading scheme right before the 2010 election, and this was a huge catalyst in his own party knifing him for Gillard. But that wasn't the end of the minority party issue.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Like in the UK, the Australian 2010 election saw a hung parliament in the lower house. In order for Labor to govern, they actually needed the support of the Greens. The Greens' demand was simple: reverse your promise to not have a carbon tax. Of course, this was political suicide for Labor, but Gillard agreed, and in my opinion, stupidly did so. Seriously, what were the Greens going to do? Back the Mineral Council's candidate in Abbott? Sure enough, Abbott hit Labor for 6 for backflipping, and despite Labor reinstating Rudd on the eve of the 2013 election, they still lost convincingly. And so for the rest of the 2010s, both UK and Aussie Labor were in the wilderness. And this highlighted issue number 2 for post-New Labor, union membership. Interestingly, both countries went for union guys. In Australia, Shorten was a key player in the Australian Workers' Union, and after Ed Miliband lost to David Cameron in 2015, UK Labor went for Jeremy Corbyn, an outspoken critic of both Blair and Brown, and someone who advocated for renationalising industry and having much more funding for public services.
That if you want a good health service, if you want a good education service, if you want an effective infrastructure in all parts of the country, not just London and the South East, yeah, sure it costs, but we all benefit as a result of that.
Unlike Blair's idea of the radical centre, Corbyn rejected New Labor to return Labor to being the advocates for workers. The issue is that this voting base has been massively nerfed, partially by their own doing, and is far less politically active. So when Thatcher came to power in 1979, 23.5% of Britain's population were in a union. Those union fees would then of course fund Labor, and so the Labor Party was the natural voting option because that's where they could have influence and sway. However, as of 2019, only 9.6% of the UK were actually unionised. Now, though Corbyn made gains against the Tories' austerity program in 2017, he then suffered a 60-seat swing against him in 2019, and Bill Shorten followed the same pattern. He made gains in 2016 and then suffered a devastating defeat in 2019. Both leaders resigned after those defeats.
I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign.
But the 2019 elections highlighted another clear issue that typically never helps Labor: the culture wars. So of course in the UK, the predominant culture war was about Brexit. What should have been an issue about whether wanted to unionise with Europe in dealing with the rest of the world or negotiate independently became an issue about whether you like multiculturalism or were based and rejected immigration. And as goes with most culture war issues, the one rallying against the so-called woke side typically wins. So when the Tories ran the Remainer Theresa May in 2017, they did much worse than running the Brexiteer Boris Johnson in 2019. Since returning to government last year, the culture wars have also been an issue for Aussie Labor, mainly around the voice to Parliament. Again, what should have been a debate as to whether a constitutionally enshrined advisory body would help for proper allocation of resources amongst Indigenous communities became a culture issue. One side rallied on woke affirmative action and the other on whether Indigenous people had the right to exist. Again, for me, totally missing the point. As has generally been the pattern, the side rallying against the woke handedly won, and Albanese spent a lot of political capital asking what I consider to be a pretty reasonable question. Even Sky News has conceded that the culture wars is the best way to defeat Labor.
This was the first time for a long time that the Liberals had fought in the culture wars. If you remember, Scott Morrison used to say, oh, I don't know, woke, too woke, what's the difference? I don't care about that, and there's no jobs in the culture wars, all this sort of stuff. It was all rubbish at the time, and Morrison deservedly got punted.
Like with Rudd, the Greens also nearly stopped Albanese's Housing Australia Future Fund from going through the Senate for not being radical enough and playing too heavily into the hands of the private sector. On top of that, our union decline is even worse than Britain, going from 43% in 1988 to just 12.5% in 2022. So to move forward, Labor parties have to manage a minority party thorn in their side, a non-unionised voting base, and more often than not, being on the losing side of a culture war. And so to survive moving forward, there's only a few options. The first is to become the Democrats and completely disregard the union background. This is a strategy we're starting to see from Keir Starmer. There's elements of New Labour about it, but I think it goes further. Since coming to power, Starmer's abandoned the 10 socialist principles that he initially campaigned on to get leadership, stopped calling himself a socialist, and instructed his cabinet not to join in union protests, not to mention also casting out Jeremy Corbyn from his party. For true believers, this looks like selling out, but it's a viable way forward that courts other interest groups in the absence of unions. The second strategy is to keep the pro-unions aspect and instead play into the culture wars but take the Tories' thunder. The West Wing actually explored this idea by having a Democrat support criminalising burning the flag. Now, there's quite few of these figures. Perhaps the best example that I could think of is Joel Fitzgibbon. He represented a coal mining district and so was a huge advocate for unions. At the same time, he was one of the biggest opponents to intense climate action, earning the name Coal Fitzgibbon and then appearing on Sky News frequently. Take this for high praise.
Well, now to the serious stuff, you can't escape the conclusion that if the Labor Party was smart enough to make Joel Fitzgibbon the leader The whole political scene in Australia would change.
Now, of course, this would mean alienating Greens voters and having to be very sly with climate action. But in Australia at least, the seats that have prioritised climate action have gone teal or Greens. Jeremy Corbyn was pro-unions and left on the culture wars. It didn't work. And so for the Labor Party to survive moving into a world where unions are becoming regrettably irrelevant, the choices are slim. If that makes you angry, your easiest move is to buck that trend and to join your union. Not to go on strike or rally against a system. A lot of bosses are good bosses, but there will always be unions influencing policy. It can either be a workers' union or a corporate union like the Business Council. If the Labor Party can't receive funding from workers' unions, it's going to have to go looking to those other unions. But for Australia, our future is looking much brighter than the UK. Did you know that Poland is predicted to overtake the UK's economy by 2030? Click here to find out why the sun has truly set on the British Empire.